Hi, and welcome back to the HE Enable podcast. This is the show all about sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in the UK higher education system. I'm Kath, and this week I am joined by the wonderful Professor Jackie Carter. She is a Professor Emerita from the University of Manchester, where she was a Professor in statistical literacy and a big advocate for invisible disabilities. Speaking of that, some of you may know Jackie as the host and founder of the University of Manchester's Let's Talk Disability podcast. This show worked on turning the feedback of disabled employees and researchers at the university into actionable change through collaboration with senior staff members. I am very excited to ask questions about that show later, and I feel so privileged to have you on the show today, Jackie. So I can't wait to get started. Hello, how's it going?
Hi, really, really well. Thank you so much for the invitation, Kath. I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure, Jackie. So obviously I know who you are. We've had a couple chats, but please could you introduce yourself for the listeners and share a little bit about your background in higher education?
Yes, of course, and I will try and be succinct.
It's okay.
Having recently retired, it's hard to pack, a 40-year career into a short, succinct summary. My background in higher education, I'm going to start at the end and then work backwards, if I may. So I retired in November 25, a few months ago, from being a professor of statistical literacy at the University of Manchester in the UK. And I also held the position of the EDI, Disability Inclusion Academic Lead. Okay, so I work really closely with, the top table at the University of Manchester on disability inclusion for staff and students. So that's sort of where I ended my career. Where I started my career in higher education was I was first in family from working class heritage background. I grew up in suburban Leeds. My dad was a tailor's cutter. He worked in a factory. My mum stayed at home and looked after the 6 kids. I went to university, and the short tale is that I managed to finish my degree. I dropped out initially, and then I went back and finished my degree. Went into a teaching career in secondary education. So I was a maths and physical education teacher in a high school for 3.5 years. My personal circumstances changed. I found myself a single mum in my early 30s, at which point I went back into education, not higher education initially, vocational education. Managed to complete a vocational course, then got onto a conversion master's course, did really well on the conversion master's course, and was recommended to do a PhD. So this was the stuff of dreams. People like me didn't go to university, never mind get to do a PhD. And then I got the PhD from the University of Leeds. I then worked in higher education for 18 years, not as an academic, as a professional services member of staff. And then I had the opportunity, because a colleague and I won a big grant from the Nuffield Foundation, who does a lot of work around educational disadvantage. And we won a big grant to set up a teaching and scholarship centre at the University of Manchester, which was about teaching social science students how to do data analysis. And my role in that was to reach out to industry, public, private, third sector industry, to create a work placement programme so that students could take their learning from the classroom, from the lecture theatre, and put it into practice in the workplace. And I argue that that was an academic role. The university agreed with me. They transferred me to an academic contract onto so I went from being a senior professional services member of staff to being an academic member of staff, having been othered for most of my career in higher education as a non-academic. And then very quickly I was promoted to professor, and that's how I became a professor in statistical literacy. But very atypical career trajectory, which I am supremely proud of now, and doing all of that, with disabilities and other challenges, shall we say, which I'm sure we'll unpack.
Yeah, that's wonderful. One thing that you wouldn't know about me is I'm second generation working class background. So I had one of my parents came from a mining town in the Midlands. Yep. And essentially also did the fight to uni kind of thing. And it's just I just love hearing those stories. I guess because they remind me of my own family, but also because it shows that it was happening. And I find that just a wonderful thing. I did my dissertation on working class backgrounds. I'm sure we'll chat about it another time.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a real awareness at the moment, actually, because socioeconomic background isn't one of the protected characteristics as disability is. And I think, there's a lot of movement actually around UK higher education at the moment to recognise the barriers that having working class heritage, that's my chosen phrase, by the way. Other people would prefer to call it something different. But, identifying as having working class heritage does affect your prospects, and it has mine. But then, as you and I both know, we have multiple identities, and that's just one part of my overarching identity.
Yeah, I want to just take this moment to shout out the Sutton Trust, who I know do amazing work from people, first generation university, working class heritage. I'm going to flip the questions a little because you've told me your journey, and I know that you've had that unconventional journey, but I was wondering what that journey was like for you. Obviously, you've laid it out step by step, but how did you find that?
Oh gosh, how on earth can I answer that in a short way? How did I find it? Right, I'm going to answer that actually in the context of this podcast series, which, by the way, is brilliant and very much needed. So I'm completely in awe of what you've done here. But also, how did I handle it? And looking back, right? So looking back over my career, I've had low level. Not always low level, but I have spent almost my entire adult life taking antidepressants. Okay. And, of course, that's a long-term health condition. And I've had periods in my career where I burnt out. They nearly always come around about Christmas, because of the build-up of the autumn term leading up to Christmas. There's so much pressure on academics, and I've only seen it increase actually, and professional services staff, not reduce. Okay. And I have looked back and realized that low level depression that I've had that has spiked and led to burnout at certain periods in my life, I've never called it a disability. And it's only now that I realize that has affected my progression through the academy, through higher education, okay? Because it's meant that I haven't had as much energy, perhaps, as some of my colleagues, okay? It's meant that I have striven or strived, whatever the correct use of the word is, to achieve heights that I've had barriers put up in front of me because of that, but also because of being a woman in higher education, which is the subject of the last book I wrote, and to try to achieve sometimes the impossible actually is incredibly challenging, difficult, exhausting, all that self-advocacy we talk about in disability circles. And then why am I sort of going all the way back to that depression as an underlying characteristic? Well, first of all, I think that probably depression is a feminist issue, trying to make it as a woman in a profession that's still largely dominated by men and was set up, by and for men over 200 years ago. Is exhausting, okay, because you're always sort of on the periphery of the system, trying to fight the system that hasn't been set up to accommodate you. And then in 2017, trigger warning, I found out I had breast cancer. Okay, so I don't know to what extent the stress that I've been under contributed to that. I don't know. And then in 2019, my son, trigger warning again, was diagnosed with an incurable brain tumour. I was writing a book and burning the midnight oil, trying to get it finished for the publisher. We were also living in temporary accommodation because our house had been flooded, so we'd been moved out by the insurance company. My son had a craniotomy, so he had surgery to remove the bulk of the brain tumour, and then he was having radiotherapy and chemotherapy in the beginning of 2020, which, cast your mind back, was locked down. So he was going through that while everybody else was, we were worried about him getting infected, going to hospital. And everybody else was sort of holed up in their homes. And then in April 2020, when he was getting close to finishing his radiotherapy, my body just stopped. I ended up going into hospital. It started out as an earache, but I came out of hospital having had something called Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, which has left me deaf, dizzy, and disabled. And that's the mantra that I use. So I think my body was under so much stress with everything that was going on, and the body does say no. There's a fantastic book, the body says no when it can no longer cope. and my body just stopped. It just stopped working. It took me a year to walk in a straight line again. When I stand up, the world still spins around me. I have, continual dizziness. I have trouble crossing roads. Before the end of my career, I had to stop teaching because it's a very physical activity. I could no longer teach because of the movement of the head and the cognitive overload of teaching. You have to be on your feet, you have to be ready to answer questions, to deliver your lecture, and in my case, computing classes as well. And I just couldn't do it. My brain got overloaded. So that was the point at which I realized that disability, almost with a big D, I was in that category. When I had the breast cancer, by the way, I didn't know that having cancer categorise you as having a disability. I didn't know that. I do now. And I've done a lot of advocacy work around that with colleagues, female and male, and that came out on the podcast. We have a whole episode devoted to talking about cancer. So I suppose, the working class heritage was my entry into higher education from the point of view of studying, but also then working in. So that was happening anyway. Then I got disabilities. I acquired disabilities, as they say, in disability study spaces. And that created more barriers because of having a disability. And, but then I was in a position of influence and power, and I was the voice of disability awareness. So I sort of tried to turn all of that adversity into making positive change, doing good.
There's a lot I want to unpick there. And I want to just take a second so I do this properly. So the syndrome you came in with, really sorry, I don't quite have the memory capacity to remember what it was called.
It's called Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, RHS, and it's when the chickenpox virus in your system re-emerges. So I had chickenpox as a child, it stays dormant in your system, and the virus can re-emerge, and it's particularly likely to re-emerge as a result of being under stress and having a poor immune system. I also have a blood condition, which means I don't produce neutrophils, so I can't fight infection. So it was almost like a perfect storm.
The only time I've heard of symptoms like that is when people have gone on cruise ships and they'll come off and the dizziness kind of stays.
Yeah, I learned about that. That's a slightly different condition. Got a French title, I can't remember what it's called. It's something about still feeling dizzy as if you've just come off a boat or an aeroplane. Mine's not like that. It's not caused by the same thing, but it is caused by the inner ear. The nerve in my inner left ear was damaged. So I'm deaf on that side now. I can't hear. I wear hearing aids on both sides, but I'm deaf on that side. I've got tinnitus. And as I said, the world spins around me all the time.
Obviously, there's a lot there to unpack. I know that I've seen you doing a lot of advocacy and fundraising for cancer wards and treatment, and what I will do is, I know you have a fundraising link, I will put that in the description of the show. So if you want to find out more about the fundraising that Jackie is doing, especially for her son, you can read about that all in the description of this episode. I'll be sure to pop the link in there. If I remember my other question, I will ask it in a second. Maybe what you say will jog my memory. We're kind of ping-ponging around a bit, and you've already mentioned some of this, but if you're comfortable saying, how did your disabilities impact your experience of higher education, if you have anything else to add?
Okay, so one of the things that I think is really important, so I haven't used the term yet, and you can't see me because this is an audio recording, but I am wearing and always wear in professional environments a sunflower lanyard. So the sunflower lanyard denotes that I have hidden or invisible disabilities, okay? And I wear it with pride for a particular reason. One is because here's the stats now. I always get into everything I say.
Literally your job.
25% of the working age population has a disability or long-term condition that affects them. Okay, that's high, 25%. So every room we go into, with 4 people or more, there's likely to be, not always, but there's likely to be somebody with a disability. 80% of disabilities, it's estimated, are unseen. So if you're sitting in a room with people who don't appear to have a disability, that doesn't mean that you're sitting in a room with people who don't have a disability or long-term condition. So I wear my lanyard to show that I have a hidden disability. I did a big campaign at the University of Manchester with the Students' Union to highlight the reason why, we wear our sunflower lanyards or a pin badge. And it's really an awareness raising exercise, and that's what I'm trying to do here. But the reason that matters to me is because I am more aware than ever in a professional setting, be it at the university or elsewhere, that there will be people there who are carrying the burden of being disabled or having a long-term condition and may have chosen not to share it. And I use the word share advisedly. I don't like the term disclose because it suggests that, there's something wrong with you. And as far as I'm concerned, it's just part of the human condition, being disabled. So what I have done a lot of is be the voice in the room that I want to hear. And again, that's a little mantra that I use. And so if I give talks to students, and I get invited to give talks to a lot of student societies, and also lecturers have invited me in to talk about disability inclusion and what it means and disability advocacy, because we know it's rife in the student population. My gosh, who knows more than anybody else, Kath, than you? And so what I will do is I will often start by describing myself in the language that I've used here. So I'm deaf, dizzy and disabled, and I'm of working class heritage, because students don't necessarily know that if we don't tell them. And I've had students come up to me after say, thank you so much. I have a condition. I haven't shared it with anybody, but it affects my ability to be able to do well. And, I need some support. These are my needs. This is the support I need. And I either have or haven't gone to seek that support. So the reason I'm focusing here on students is because it's one thing to do this with staff who are already professionals in their space, okay? And we'll come to that when we talk about the podcast, hopefully. But I think we owe it to our student population to show them and tell them that there are people in their midst, people who walk among them, who teach them, or who administer at the university, who also know and have lived and living experience about being disabled. And if we're not vocal about it, and that's not to say everybody needs to be an advocate, not everybody needs to speak out about it. Some people may, for very, very valid reasons, not want to speak out about it. But those of us who are, and I consider myself with, huge privilege, those of us who have that privilege, I feel it's beholden on us, if we feel able to speak out on behalf of marginalised and minoritized groups. Yeah. I feel really strongly about that, as you know, Kath.
Yeah, and it's also about, if you're not part of a particular group, making sure that you can use that privilege to give them a platform as well. I remember I had Emma on a while ago talking about global majority folk and like their research in that, and that was so valuable, but it's not something I could have said myself as a very, very white person. I'm very pale. I do remember what I was going to ask you.
Go for it.
So you mentioned you didn't know that your depression was a disability, nor your cancer. And it reminded me of a conversation I had on the show with Louisa, who was an architecture student. So Louisa was an international student, and she didn't know the British laws and she didn't know the cultural differences. And we had a whole discussion on how you even find out that what you have constitutes a disability in the first place. And it's really interesting to me. Obviously, I had that conversation from an international student perspective, but you also experienced that. And that would have been, with the same Equality Act and everything. So
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's what we don't know is sort of really at the crux of the matter, isn't it? And I suppose the work that I've tried to do, and the reason I set the podcast up that we'll talk about in a minute, is to raise awareness, but also go from raising awareness to moving to action and accountability. Okay, so it's one thing to know, and it's one thing to sort of understand, there are 9 protected characteristics, and what does that mean? And what does that mean an organisation needs to do? And what do the individuals in that organisation need to be aware of? But then putting that into practice for the student body, it becomes everybody's responsibility, I think. As I say, I worked at the University of Manchester for 29 years and left recently, and we have an amazing disability advisory support service. It's incredible what they're able to do on relatively low resource, actually, given the student numbers that we have at Manchester. But it's not just their responsibility. Okay, they're there to provide a focal point for accommodations and support for disabled students and students who have needs that need to be accommodated and protected by law. But every person who teaches in a classroom, or every person who, works in one of the outlets in the university, also has a responsibility to ensure that everybody is getting an inclusive experience in whatever shape or form. So it really is an endemic issue and a systemic issue. And you and I could talk, and we know because we're in the group already, but if we all worked together and if we all created those accessible places, that everybody benefits. It's not like we're doing something special for the minority group of students, marginalised group of students. We're doing something that everybody can benefit from. And I think it's shifting that mindset, turning it around to say, well, if we designed buildings, if we designed classes, if we designed lecture theatres, if we designed, eating experiences on campus to be accessible to everybody, then it's inclusive by design. It's inclusive by design. And that's the challenge, I think, for let's focus still on higher education. It needs to take a long, hard look at itself in the mirror and realise what it needs to do to design experiences that everybody benefits from.
I feel like I should put you in touch with the Neurodiversity Architecture Network, which funnily enough was also set up by Louisa. I think you guys would have a great chat about inclusive spaces.
Please do.
I will. So we're almost there to talking about the podcast. I wanted to ask one more question first. So again, we've kind of dotted about everything, but if you have anything extra to add, did you encounter any obstacles during your experience of higher education? Did you overcome them? And if so, how?
Yeah, hundreds, sadly.
Yeah, fair enough.
And it was the obstacles I encountered and how I addressed overcoming them that led me to write the book with Linda Baines, my co-author. And the book is called Practitioner, Professor, Researcher, Reformer, Women's Atypical Stories. And I suppose if I had to choose one, because we haven't got all day, have we? If I had to choose one, the obstacles I mostly encountered were people's attitudes. And I'm just going to pause there for effect, really, because I have worked with incredible people throughout my career, stellar academics and professional services staff. And yet, I think one of the major obstacles that I have come up against time and time again is people saying, to all intents and purposes, we don't do it like that around here. And it's almost like they're so ingrained in the way that academia has been set up that it's too big a challenge for them, a leap of faith almost, to think about doing it differently. And that's why I'm really excited to be in this space at the moment. My Vice Chancellor of the university I've just left, Duncan Iverson, called me a positive disruptor. And I write about positive disruptors in the book that I've written with Linda, and also about torchbearers. And I think, if people haven't been there before, then we need people to come and bear the torch for others to follow in the path. And so the biggest obstacles have actually been not systems. I really struggle with the term systems because it just sounds so, out of a book. Systems are people. Systems and processes are people. And people change systems and processes. There's no magic wand that you wave over a system or a process and it gets changed. It's the people who see how a system needs to be changed, that advocate for that change individually and collectively and go in and change it. And that's, again, what I'll segue into the podcast. That's really what I tried to do with the podcast, is to look at the system, see what was working, see what wasn't working, and then think about mechanisms for change. So the biggest barriers in my career have been people who have stepped in front of me and said, you can't do that. And yet my strategy is to go around in another direction. It's always to be, I've given you my story, I moved from being a PS to an academic. It's to find a way and to get people on your side to help you do that.
I hope you're doing motivational speaking now.
I'm looking into it, and if anybody listens to this and wants to invite me, please do. I've done a couple of talks and I love it. I did a talk at the start of the year for a Women Leading in Business event, and it was just magical. It was beautiful. I did 5 minutes of that talk in rhyme.
Oh, I wish I could have seen that.
I don't think it was recorded, but I'll share the rhyme with you.
Oh, yes, please. So I'm actually a bit guilty of this. I talk a lot about like systematic failures in higher education, and I'm wondering whether it's the reason, I guess, you have the privilege maybe of using different rhetoric for that is because you've managed to get yourself in this position of power. Feel free to like interject on this. When I come from this from a student perspective, a lot of this seems very faceless. I've fallen through the cracks a couple times, and sometimes, you know, there are no people to blame. Something just didn't go through or get processed, or the person doesn't work there anymore. And it can feel like it's part of a bigger problem. I've been on the other side of that as well, and I've managed, I did some reform on preferred names in eVision when I was at York, and we managed to like modify SITs. It was wild. But for the most part, like, at least from a student perspective, I find like systematic stuff quite a good narrative to use. But I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
You are so, well, I'm trying to think of the right word. Okay, you are so acutely aware of the need for power. Okay, you're so incisive. You're absolutely right. And you're absolutely right to point the mic back at me and say, could it be that you have got platforms with certain power, because, and that brings, you know, your privilege brings power, and that brings, and yes, and I would say as well that I have been very, I don't really use the word strategic, but where there have been opportunities for me to have my voice heard, and it's not just my voice, it's my voice that is representing a group of minoritized and marginalized people, I have tried to use that, as I said earlier, to good effect. And I think so often in disability spaces, we are shouting into the wind. I could have used another word there, but we are shouting into the wind. There is a backlash against EDI. There's a bigger backlash against disability inclusion for pernicious reasons that we're seeing play out in our own government at the moment. But there have always been backlashes against oppressed groups and minoritized groups. Okay, so my take on that is, you know, and don't get me wrong, I'm not always this positive. People who know me have seen me in heaps on the floor. I've come out of rooms, high-powered rooms in universities before, crying because I couldn't hear. No matter how many times I asked people to speak up or use the mic, they assumed that they didn't, you know. So it isn't easy, this stuff. It's hard. And there are people who may listen to this, people who've been on my podcast who have been there to pick me back up again. And that need to have your support network is crucial, because I am not one person. I am doing this with others surrounding me. So shout out to the National Association for Disabled Staff Networks, led by Dr. Hamid Haroon, who is now the academic lead for disability inclusion at Manchester. He stepped into the role that I vacated. And that group, and I've got other groups, Ride Higher, led by Dr. Melanie Best at the University of Wolverhampton, where we're in this space together trying to make this system change that you talk about. But no one person can do it. You're absolutely right. I think it's beholden on those of us who do have positions of influence and power to use those positions to not just advocate for change, but make it happen. You know, hold to account. I think the missing piece in all of this is accountability. And again, I'll talk about that in how I set the podcast up. I saw a lovely piece on LinkedIn this weekend, Kath. I don't know if you saw it, and I commented on it. And the phrase that I took, it was a mnemonic for inclusion. The point I took away, because I'm a butterfly, I hone in on things and then sort of, I don't always get the depth. But the piece I took away was representation without power is performance. And I think there's a lot of performativity, or maybe it was performativity. There's a lot of performativity, I can't say that word, performativity in the EDI space and in the disability space. And I think one of the problems, as I said earlier, is because a lot of it can't be seen. The optics of disability inclusion is tremendously tricky because, you know, you ask what people think of when they think of disabilities. And, you know, the international symbol is a person in a wheelchair. And we know that people who are wheelchair users are a very small proportion. I think it's about 4%, and they don't necessarily use wheelchairs all the time. And yet here we are looking at an image of a disabled person and putting into somebody's head what a disabled person looks like, you know, which is why I'm so obsessed with invisible disabilities and hidden disabilities and silent disabilities. I have deafness, and I'm writing a piece with somebody at the moment about hearing loss, but also about people who can't hear at all. The differences, the cultural differences. The deaf community has a cultural identity, deaf with a capital D. I think that piece that you talked about is about coming together and ensuring that we are not just supporting each other, but we've got allies in this space, people with powerful voices that can affect change. And nobody ever said it was going to be easy. Okay, disability rights, like other rights groups, have been fighting for a long time for better experiences, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop fighting.
Yeah. Did you make it to the disability exhibit in the V&A before it closed?
No, I didn't. I'm sorry. I only went down to London that one time when I couldn't meet up with you, and I didn't get there, but hopefully there'll be other opportunities.
Yeah, I'll send you some pictures I took, but you've raised a really valid point. So people who have followed the show for a few months will know that I did a rebrand in January. I changed the logo. I ever so slightly changed the spelling of the show. And I was thinking, like, what iconography do I use to convey what I do, which is share lived experiences of disability, neurodivergence, long-term health conditions in higher education, specifically in the UK, but, it's a pretty universal message. And I could not think of what iconography to use. It's like, well, I don't want to use a wheelchair. Like, any representation that I use of a person is not going to be inclusive of the entire population. And so I ended up sticking with the graduate cap. It's not perfect. It doesn't necessarily cover staff or those who are working at universities or, institutions without degrees. But yeah, it is really hard to capture a population. And what I will also say is that obviously we talk about having these support networks. I think it's not just having people speaking up for us and having just sheer numbers. I think that in a community where a lot of us have energy limiting conditions or, can't be out and doing this for extended periods of time, if we have more people, it gives others the chance to rest. And I think sometimes that isn't necessarily acknowledged in the same way that it should be.
Yes, I think you've highlighted something incredibly important. And, if your needs mean that you require longer to do something or more rest, then again, that needs to be accepted, acknowledged, and supported.
Yeah, totally agree.
And we need to go out in numbers to say that.
And, if you can't do it physically, we try it virtually. I struggle to have energy to advocate, but I have the show, and I hope it gets to be used as a platform for something. I also just wanted to highlight that we talk about disability being demonized. I don't have the statistic to hand, but I know that there's a higher proportion of the disabled population who identify as LGBTQ+, myself included, and I know that the rhetoric around that right now, combined with disability, is probably making life harder for advocates. So if you can, support your disability communities, also go and support your LGBTQ+ and queer communities. It will go a long way. Right, should we talk about your podcast?
Yeah, but before we do, you've just sparked another point, which I think is really interesting. So because I'm a sort of person who's works a lot with data, statistical data, I'm all about data and storytelling, really. I hope that's come across, numbers and stories and stories and numbers. But the data angle is really an interesting one because I sit on various external groups, okay, and I was at a group, I'm not going to name them, but I was at a group recently and they were talking about the priority areas in the EDI space. And it was very clear that what they'd done is looked at their data broken down by race, gender, some disability, and there were other characteristics I can't remember. And then they had prioritized the spaces where they had good data. Let's just say that. And we know, because of the reasons why people don't always want to share their disability in an organization, we know that the data that are collected are an approximation at best and an undercount for sure. We know that they're an undercount for reasons why, people might be disabled, they might not know, for the reasons we've said earlier, that, cancer, for instance, means that you're categorized as disabled. And therefore, the data that is informing the policies and areas that organizations are focusing on in their EDI plans cannot be well informed if the data are poor. I'm just trying to use nice terms here. If you've got bad data, you're going to get bad policy. All right, it's as simple as that. So I challenged them, this high level group, and they said, well, we hadn't really thought about that. What we'll do is reprioritize and go out and do some lived experience work. And, but it took me to point out to them that their data was not giving them well-informed platforms to build on for a group that is, as I said earlier, 25% of the population. So I think things like that, we need to keep pushing back. We need to say, here are the numbers. The numbers are limited in some sense. We really need the stories as well, because they tell you the why. And it's the collection of both the stories and the numbers that is going to lead to a better outcome for disabled people, staff, students, regardless of organisation.
I'm going to go my final quick tangent. So a couple of weeks ago, I did an episode sponsored by Disabled Students UK for the 2025 Disabled Students annual report, which, I'm sure you've seen all my furore about it on social media. It was great fun, but one thing we noticed is that the majority of the demographics, and I'm really generalizing here, are white female undergraduates. And what I want to do again is just use this platform to say, if you can, or people who can take part in the Disabled Student Survey when it comes out this year, go do it. I think there's a link in that episode to go be notified when it opens. Please do that. If you're a student, if you're staff. I'm not sure on the equivalence, Jackie, you'd have to enlighten me. I hope there's something.
Oh, in the staff area, yeah, that we ran our first, through the Ride Hire group I mentioned earlier, we ran our first national survey a year ago, and we're going to be running it again next year. That's headed up by, she's at the University of Salford now, Professor Carol. I can never remember her surname, but I can put a link to that if that would be helpful in the show. To not the survey itself, but the results from the survey, which are pretty depressing in terms of disabled staff's experiences in higher education.
Unfortunately, I think that's the biggest common ground it probably has at the student report. Let's talk about your show. Let's make this a little bit cheerier. So you created and used to host. I don't think you host it anymore, do you?
We're under discussion.
Okay. You created and big air quotes host the Let's Talk Disability podcast at the University of Manchester. I love listening to these episodes. They're a great time. But, not everyone here is going to know about it because they don't spend their days lurking on LinkedIn looking for podcasts in their niche. So for those who are listening, what is this show about and what outcomes came from it?
Oh, thank you so much for highlighting it. Let's Talk Disability. Not Let's Talk About Disability. Let's Talk Disability was set up because when I took on the role as academic lead for disability inclusion, I realised that there was a gaping hole in talking about disability as a lived experience at the University of Manchester. It was not as well acknowledged as some of the other protected characteristics, so I set out to fill the hole. Well, we did a needs analysis first of all, and then I realised that from those conversations and the data we'd collected, qualitative and quantitative, we needed to raise the profile of talking about the lived experience of disability. So I'd always fancied doing a podcast. It's fun doing a podcast, isn't it, Cal? And I decided what I wanted to do was a podcast with a purpose, a podcast that would make a difference. We've got a lovely podcast recording studio at Manchester. I decided I would be the host. I would invite 2 guests onto each episode. I would invite a guest from the senior leadership team. It's dotted around the university, not just top table, but people embedded into senior roles across the university. It's a big university, Manchester. And I would invite a person with lived and living experience of having a disability or long-term condition who I had met and spoken to, and they were happy to come on and talk in their own words about what that meant. And that person was either a member of staff, so they were an academic or a professional services colleague, or they were a postgraduate researcher, somebody starting out in their research life. And we got up to 20 episodes by the time I left. And at the end of each episode, so I would host, that they would talk about what it meant to have a disability or long-term condition, or be a carer for somebody who has. Actually, we also reached out to somebody who was a carer, and how it affected their experience working at the University of Manchester or studying to be a researcher. But at the end of each episode, and this is a coup de grace really, I insisted that each of them commit to an action. So the disabled person got to ask the leader, what will you do as a result of having been on this podcast episode? Right. So there was one action. We called it just one things. And then in reverse, the leader, who may or may not have been disabled and may or may not have talked about disability and long-term condition, got to ask the disabled person. Disabled is a catch-all, by the way. I'm just using it short term. What one thing would make the biggest difference to their experience working or studying at the University of Manchester. So with that, with 20 episodes, I came away with 2 actions for each. And I've recently written an academic article that's going to go into a chapter in a book that's being written on disability rights. And it's called Let's Talk Disability, a podcast with a purpose. And it's analysed the commitments and the actions that people said that they would follow through after the podcast. And then it's followed up on these actions to see what's happened. So I've got like an audit trail of what people spoke about, what they said they would do, and then have they implemented that. And when the book comes out, I'll obviously let you have a chapter. I think I may have sent you a draft copy of the chapter, Kath. But it's interesting. It's interesting how every disabled person responded very, very quickly to their commitment to action and said what they'd done, because they've gone away and they've been more vocal in advocating not just for themselves, but for others. And they've got involved with external groups. It was much harder to get the senior leaders who were on the podcast episodes to first of all respond to my request for information. Busy people, get that. I'm not sort of, naming and shaming anybody, but this is sort of the reality of, if we ask people to commit to something, do they do it? And also, at the same time, it was more dispersed what their commitments turned into. So some of them have gone off and are now working at national level with other museums, for instance, on making their exhibitions more accessible. Other people have said that they'll introduce it into their staff meetings, but there's no evidence that they've actually done that. So it's sort of interesting to see what the response to that has been. But nonetheless, it means that we have a mechanism at Manchester University that we didn't used to have, because there's so many meetings and so many commitments to action and so many action plans. Who's ever really looking at those to bring it all together in the EDI space? And it shifted the conversation. Disability inclusion is much more talked about. We won an award for culture change for the podcast. So yeah, I think it has alerted the university to this being a really important issue they need to focus on.
Thank you for sending me the draft of that chapter, by the way. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I think there was one response I want to pick out, and tell me if I have to take this out. But there was a response that was, I think, from the senior staff, and they raised it, and it was just like, well, the meeting was poorly attended, so there wasn't much that we could do after that. And as someone who spent, 5 years in student voice, and now I do this, that one really hurt my heart, because you can tell that it ended at attendance, and there probably wasn't much beyond that. But for the most part, it was actually like, especially from people who are on that weren't the senior staff members, who were, the guests, they, for the most part, found it to be a really positive outcome.
Yeah. Thank you for gleaning that from the draft chapter I sent you. You're absolutely right to pick that out. Okay, this isn't, this has to be warts and all. If we're going to have these conversations, we have to highlight where there are tensions, where there are non-follow through, if you like, of actions. And an action can be taken by one person, but often that action is about engendering change in a different part of the system, and one in which they have some influence. But if then the people who are there to affect that change don't turn up, then this is where I'm a bit like is it a dog with a bone? Is that the phrase where if I was still in that role, I would be following that up. I would have looked at that. Well, I did look at that, but then I stepped back from my role. But actually what you've given me, Kath, is a beautiful action to take back to the current lead to say, look, this is what came out of what happened in the first 20 episodes. Now you're in a position of influence to be able to affect change. Can you follow up? Okay, there's always somebody, and this is the thing with institutions like higher education. They have short memories, Okay, so that long-term institutional memory, unless you've been around a long time like I have, gets changed every few years. Somebody else comes in, they might do the same thing, something completely different. But that longitudinal effect, that's the piece that's missing. There's a lot of short-termism, I think, in higher education, ironically, because of the nature of how it works. People tend to do leadership roles for 3-5 years. Something like 4-5 of the 20 people that had been on the podcast had left that role by the time I came back to them. And I enumerated that in the chapter. I remember doing that. So that continuity of change needs to be picked up and owned by somebody. And I said at the very end of the chapter, because the university has disability confident level 3, which is leadership status, and I have very strong views on disability confident. I don't think it's fit for purpose, which is why I'm involved in Ride Higher. Nonetheless, if the university has a commitment to a framework, because it's not a charter marker framework, then that requires the university to show how it's addressing gaps, and it needs to change and it needs to be more inclusive. So the action can be attached to the action plan, and I've already fed that back. So I know it will continue to exist in some shape or form. It's whether or not the person responsible for that action then follows through.
I mean, you know this better than anyone. This is what you did at Manchester for a while, actually, and I need to listen to more episodes. I did listen to the museum one you alluded to. I listened to the latest one. I will pop the Spotify link again in the description of this episode. We're going to have a very long description, Jackie. How do you feel rapid firing those last few questions there?
Yeah, absolutely. Just go for it. I'll try and be short.
Wonderful. Thank you. So obviously you've done incredible stuff. I can't list every award that you have because I will run over time. I know you were in the Disability Power 100 a few years ago. You got the Change Making Award in Manchester as well. What advice can you give to members of staff trying to enact positive change at their own institution?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to caveat this, first of all, by going back to what I shared earlier about my own brush with cancer, but also my son having an incurable brain tumour. Okay, so he's 7 years on from diagnosis. Sadly, brain cancer is the biggest killer of under 40-year-olds. So we live under a very stressful cloud of knowing that his life will be terminated by the condition that he has, because modern day treatments haven't moved on in that area as they have done in some other cancer areas. So the caveat that I am going to just push out there is that I know, as do the people I move in circles with, that life is short, right? And I know how it took me a long time to get to a position where my voice was heard, right? I'm not saying everybody listened to my voice, acted on it, but I know I was that positive disruptor, that agitator, and activist. I have no shame in saying that. I do a lot of activism in gender spaces. And so on the basis of that, the advice I would give to my younger self, and I would give to people listening to this podcast, is be that voice, or find somebody who will be that voice for you. And I've added on the last bit because I was in a session a week ago in which somebody said to me, it's great that you can be that voice, Jackie. It's brilliant. We need people like you, but I can't do it because it's not safe. Right. And I completely get, and Kath, you and I have talked a little bit about this. Yeah. There are times in your life when, for whatever reason, you might not be able to be that voice. But there are people out there who can be that voice on your behalf, can advocate for you. They can be in a group, they can be in a national network. They can be somebody who goes into a meeting with you, a colleague, a friend. Find the person who can be your advocate or be that advocate for others. So I think that's the single piece of advice I'd want to give, because we need more voices. We need more strong voices to advocate on behalf of the disability community, because we are at a crux, we're at a crisis point in disability inclusion at the moment, in the UK anyway, and definitely in higher education. And we need to go beyond what we talked about earlier, performativity. I said it this time. And we need to move to action and accountability. And we're not going to do that just by shouting into the wind. We have to get smart. So yeah, that's my advice, to be that voice. Or if it can't be you for whatever reasons, then find somebody who can advocate on your behalf. And then come onto podcasts like Kath's and mine and, talk about the need to understand the lived and living experience.
Absolutely. My door's always open. If anyone has a story to share, drop me an email, drop me a DM where you can find me, and I'll get you on. Yeah, and absolutely. And also, I want to put in a caveat here. Obviously, I don't want people to be having to share their diagnosis if they don't feel safe and where they don't feel that, they can be an activist right now. I just want to say, be mindful of who you get to help you. I feel that a lot of the onus sometimes can be put on students who might not necessarily carry that same power. So if you don't feel like you're safe to share your diagnosis or do things relating to it directly, just make sure that you pick that network appropriately. And also remember that the law will back you up. A surprising amount of people don't remember the Equality Act exists and is more powerful than they probably give it credit for. I think that's just what I tack on to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you talked about the law, because that's something I've often said to people. You are protected. You're protected by the Equality Act 2010 by virtue of being disabled or having a condition that affects you. Yeah, thank you for adding that. That's important.
That's all right. Next question. Because you've interacted so much with postgraduate researchers and members of staff, what advice would you give to, PGR member of staff, early career researcher, whatever, navigating a new diagnosis?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. We have a project at the University of Manchester, and it's called Realising Disability Inclusion for PGRs, postgraduate researchers and early career researchers. And it's a year's project, and the RA, or the research associate on the project, is absolutely brilliant. She is a traumatic brain injury survivor. She is working hand in glove with myself and others. So I'm still volunteering on the project, even though I've left, because I'm so committed to it. I set the project up, then left, but I wanted to stay involved. And we're doing 3 things on that project. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because this could be a PGR listening to this who might want to do something similar at their institution. Okay, so I'm giving tips and advice on what we've decided to do. So we have set a fund up for postgraduate researchers and early career researchers to apply for if they have additional costs associated with being a PGR or ECR. So it could be that they go to a conference and because of mobility issues, they can't take public transport. So they can apply to the fund to take Ubers or taxis, and we will support that. So it's costs over and above what it would cost if they didn't have a disability. We've also brought in some disabled-led coaching and development training for a group, and that's just kick-started, and we're going to be doing some qualitative research on that. The other strand is on the basis of Laura's own experience as a PGR at Manchester. She did an archaeology doctorate. We are developing an e-comic based on her story, so we're going to have a comic as an output to show that it's not just about your experience, but it's how you get the right supervisors to support you. And so she and her supervisor are telling the story of how they did it for Laura. So we're very conscious again that there's very little material out there for postgraduate researchers, and PGRs often fall between the cracks because you're not an undergraduate student, you're not taught. Graduate student, you may or may not be doing teaching. And so you're quite a small niche coherent group, but coming together and having strength in numbers. And this is what Laura did through her doctoral journey. She set up a network for PGR students, and I know she'd be more than happy to talk to anybody who was interested. So get in touch with me and I can get you in touch with Laura to talk about that. So yeah, I think it comes back to everything we've been saying, actually, Kath. It's about strength in numbers, finding your networks and support groups, but making sure you're not just talking to each other, you're then reaching out to others who can add to the support that you as a group need. And the last thing I want to say, because it sounded, a lot of what we said today sounds really negative, but disabled students and staff are absolutely brilliant. As Laura said, Laura says all the time, we've already navigated all of these boundaries, all of these barriers, all of these huge mountains to climb. And here we are achieving against all the odds. So there are many, many of us, we don't always talk about it, but there are many of us doing it in spite of, not because of. And I think, we've got to remember here that there's huge value in having diverse populations in staff and student bodies. And we sort of know that, but we've got to say it more proudly and loudly.
Yeah. This next question I usually ask earlier in the show, but I wasn't quite sure where to put it this week because we had so much to cover. But it's something I ask all of my guests. No is a complete answer here. Have you ever experienced any instances of your disabilities proving helpful in a higher education setting?
Yeah, and I'm not going to go down the superpower of
That's fine.
Yes. Okay, so being disabled got me the job as a disability lead at the University of Manchester because it was a condition of applying that you had to have lived experience of being disabled or having a disability. And I used that to, I think, great effect. So I would very vocally be the person in the room that said, if I can't see you moving your lips, I can't hear you. So I put sort of disability inclusion from my needs perspective on the table right at the start of nearly every meeting I went into, did the stuff that I've talked about around the Sunflower Lanyard campaign, very vocal, set up the podcast. So I think my lived experience of being disabled at the University of Manchester has positioned me to be the torchbearer actually for others. And I am going to sort of own that because I do think prior to me being in that role, we had somebody else in role and she was wonderful, but it wasn't as acknowledged or recognised as a protected characteristic in the way it is now. That's been helpful was a word that you use. And the other thing that I would say is I've never had a diagnosis. I've never gone down the neurodivergent pathway. I don't know if I am or I'm not, but I do know, I think, creatively, and I'm a real polymath. I'm a trained mathematician and computer scientist now working in social science. I think systemically and very analytically, and I think I've used that way that I've addressed everything I've ever faced in my life. I'm not just talking about academic issues, but everything that has been thrown at me, I sort of step back and use that way of approaching problem solving by nature. I'm a problem solver by nature. And I think I've done that in a way that's helpfully moved on a lot of the activity I've been involved in, include disability inclusion, but also, gender activism that I've talked about earlier. All of the work I've done about building bridges in work placements between higher education and the workplace. I couldn't have done that without that sort of very colourful career trajectory, that squiggly career that I've had. And I think I've had that career because I have a way of thinking about gaps and solution problem solving holistically. I think that has really, really helped me. So I would say yes. And it's not until the tail end of my career that I've recognised that's a real power and strength that I've been able to build on.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think that you've hit the nail on the head. Your story is so rich. At times, obviously not a positive one as we'd expect in any human life, but I think that what you've done with it, especially with at least what we see as an external output, right, is absolutely incredible, and you deserve every accolade you get.
Oh, thank you, Kath. I feel very humble, but I just want to say that I've never done, you coming from the background I come from, you don't shout about your successes, okay? I wasn't brought up to sort of, be a big head about anything I did. Been in lots of meetings and network meetings with people who say, well, I'll never be able to do that. But had I not learned how to do that, I wouldn't have had some of the accolades, but recognition. People wouldn't have listened to me because I would have flown under the radar. So I've actually had to be quite strategic and operational in learning how to self-advocate. Let's just call it self-advocate, to be able to use the systems around me to develop that acknowledgement of, I keep using the term recognition. It's not about me. It sounds awful. So, I've got all these awards. It's not about me. It's about what do we need to do as individuals to create collective change for the people who are minoritized and marginalized. So it's never been about me. It's always been about where do I play? What's my role in this? What can I do to fight the bigger cause? And the bigger cause is disability rights.
Yeah. I think it's also the reason I say that is because we know what your accolades represent.
Yeah.
I will shout about you because I know you do incredible work.
Thank you. Well, that's That's kind. Thank you.
Yeah. Last couple of questions. We've been chatting for much longer than we were meant to, but I'm glad that we did. Let's just wrap this up though. So I said earlier, you've mentioned that you've left the University of Manchester. You're now Professor Emerita. I know you're not a big fan of the word retired, and I'm going to use it here in very loose quotation marks, because you are just such a busy person, even now that you've left Manchester. But what are your next steps now that you have, quote unquote, retired?
Okay, thank you for the quote unquote, because as far as I'm concerned, I'm not retired. I've just stopped working at the University of Manchester. I have so much more to still do in this space. And like you, I've got limiting energy and I've got other commitments that we've spoken about. But I am absolutely on a mission to do anything I can, particularly in this space. So the areas that I can most contribute to are the building bridges, sort of taking skills from the classroom and putting them into practice in the workplace. And that was the subject of my first book. But what I'm really passionate about, as I hope has come across, and I think you've reflected very well, is, how can I continue to advocate for disability inclusion generally. So I'm currently open and available. Okay, I am doing some work for non-payment, so I'm doing some volunteer work, which I've already talked about, but I am looking to do some consultancy, so I am sort of out there. I'm also really keen, and let's just put it out there, Kath, you and I are sort of uniquely placed in UK higher education for having developed podcasts that shine a light on disability and accessibility in UK HE. I think it's fair to say that you predominantly focus on students and I predominantly focus on staff, but there's real overlap in what we're doing. So I think, again, there's an interesting conversation to have there. And my intention that I haven't yet realised, but is swirling around in my head somewhere, is to scale up and out. So, at the end of the book chapter that I wrote, I said one of the things that I wanted to do was take the Let's Talk Disability podcast and scale it up across the sector. And the sector doesn't necessarily have to be UK higher education. So I'm sort of interested in opportunities. And for the first time in my life, I'm also sort of not chasing things. I'm looking to see what emerges, and this emerged, and other things are emerging. I'm on another podcast soon and talking on some International Women's Day activities and panels. So I'm open and available to interesting areas of work aligned to disability inclusion generally.
And I hope we get the chance to work more together in the future. We've had a couple of chats before this.
Yeah. I think it could be very powerful.
Yeah, I think it could be. Let me know if you hear anything from anyone interested, and I'll let you know the same. Final question. We've covered a lot of ground. We've slightly overrun because there was so much ground to cover, and I am okay with that. I hope that you are. I was just wondering, we've covered so much ground, but if we were to condense your story down, maybe put these thoughts into a couple of sentences, what is one key takeaway that you would like listeners to remember from your story?
First of all, nothing is ever wasted. I've had success, but I've also had a lot of times when I wasn't successful. I don't like the word failure, but if you want to use failure, I've learned from failure. Nothing you do is ever wasted. Secondly, all the adversities I've faced in life that I've talked about on this episode have set me up for dealing with the biggest adversity I hope I'll ever have to face, which again I've talked about. So everything I've ever had to deal with, from my own background, from personal experience, from my own health challenges, from knockbacks at work, from squiggly career, they have given me a basket of skills and personal stories and connections with others that I've been able to use to deal with the big blow that I was dealt with in 2019, 2020 from my son's health condition. So nothing's ever wasted. Adversity sort of sets you up for dealing with whatever life throws at you. And then the final thing, I think, is find your networks. That is so important. Find the people that sustain you. And it took me a long time to realize this, cut loose the people who don't. That's really hard. I'm a person who feels things very deeply, but I've had to sort of put people at arm's length when I have had to look after them as well as looking after myself and others. And that was a really hard lesson to learn. So, yeah, find your networks, find the people who support you and sustain you, but don't spend time with people who don't, because it's exhausting. But I want to end up on a positive note and say nothing is so large that you can't deal with it. And that includes in the disability space. There are people around to help you, support mechanisms, people like Kath who invite you onto a show to talk about your own lived experience. And you can be that person for other people as well.
Yeah. I have nothing to add to that. Thank you, Jackie. Let me just close up the show. So the HE Enable podcast is the show dedicated to sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in UK higher education. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for your patience while I took a week away from the show. I was not going to push it and try and record this episode while I was sick, and I'm glad I didn't. Link to the Patreon will be in the episode description. Likewise, if you're interested in being a guest, drop me an email. There's a link tree in the show description, email links at the bottom. If not, you've probably found me through a social media platform. Drop me a DM. Cool. Jackie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kath. Thank you.